Margaret, it's Patricia here, Patricia Amphlett. You are
I
known
know.
and you're known as, and deservedly so, as one of Australia's finest interpretive singers,
Yes.
and you've become well known because of that. And I'm wondering how a girl in Australia grew up. How did you manage to like what was called way back Negro music? We call it
Yeah.
Black American music now. How
Yeah.
did you discover that, and which took you into the world of gospel, trips away? Where did that come from?
That's a mystery to me too, because really, my conservative Irish Australian background, there's no reason why one would land on, far left jump, I suppose, to immerse yourself in African American music in all forms. Yes, gospel and blues and everything from play party songs from the Caribbean. I used to dabble with, and throw in somewhere, but I'm not sure. I think it was partly the sound of the music, but I also always would get into the background. Why were they singing that? And of course, the story of previously Africans landing in the New World and having to come up with new forms of music and new collaborations, and the crossover between European music and African music. It just really worked for me, and so I was rather slack in presenting, Australian music. It was really only when I started to go overseas that I made an effort to learn Australian songs to present, our stuff out of the country. But otherwise, I'd probably still be stuck in everything that harked towards African American, the range of the repertoire, because I was also interested in the background and the history. And I sing less and less of it nowadays. It can even be problematic that one, this white Australian chooses to present as if having a bit of knowledge about these things, but it gets a bit tricky nowadays. But that's okay, because I'm at the age and stage where I'm tailoring off, presentations, and I don't need to work up whole programs on such things. But yes, I did. I did whole workshops on the range of African American music. But back then, for instance, I sang African songs. Well, nowadays, we have so many African performers here in Australia, but that was not the case when I started in the early 60s.
Where did you grow up, Margaret?
Up Melbourne, and I'm back in Melbourne. I was my first 3 decades of my life were based in Melbourne, and then I had 21 years in Sydney, and based in Sydney, and then I had 12 years based in Brisbane, and then 8 years back in Victoria, but in regional Victoria, East Gippsland area, and finally, about 6 years ago, I landed back in my hometown, which is fine by me, because if you're going to be in a capital city in Australia, Melbourne's the one. Sorry, guys. And also, it's before COVID changed all that, but it was sort of live music capital of the world. Could claim to be that, and one of my favourite things to do is to go out and hear other people. I don't necessarily have to be doing it myself. I enjoy what other performers are doing. I like to check on venues, and it's my way of operating in the world, really. I mean, I wouldn't have done all that travel and met all these wonderful people and done all these great things if it hadn't been for music, let's face it.
Mark, did you grow up in a musical household?
Not particularly. There was no piano or anything like that. I don't read music. I never did. Still can't really handle the dots. No, just school choir, church choir. My mother had a fantastic voice. That's part of it. But my sister, younger sister, and I, we would end up being harmonising, all the 3 of us together over the dishes sort of approach. But no, there was no thought of, it was 78 78 records on the radio, really. And we became poor. We were the nouveau poor. And so we didn't, go to too many concerts or anything like that. But there was a particularly memorable one when I was still at school, last year at school, and Paul Robeson toured Australia. Turned out to be his last performances ever. But and my parents scraped up the money for my sister and I to go to the Melbourne Town Hall to catch him. And we didn't know anything about booking, but it turns out that it was all booked out, and I'm at the box office just at the time that somebody whispers in the ear of the woman selling the tickets that they're just about to add 30 seats to the stage, and would we mind sitting behind Paul Robeson? So I'm truthfully able to say I have shared this stage with Paul Robeson.
And was he magnificent? Of course.
Oh, yeah. I mean, of course. Yes, remember it fondly and very memorable. Yeah. And subsequently I did even whole shows on Paul Robeson. The one time I was given the job of being musical director, despite not reading the dots, was a show on Paul Robeson called Deep Bells Ring, which was just presented in Sydney. I was living in Sydney, but it was a Brisbane show, and it was meant to be, originally for 2 weeks run or something. But it got such an amazing response, press-wise and audience-wise, that it was restaged around Australia pretty much over the next 3 years. And then when it came to the anniversary of the birth of Robeson in 1998, we didn't restage that. It was 5 singers and 2 actors and the box and dice, but I decided to put together a 2-hander show on Paul Robeson for a couple of years that was called Robeson Keeps Rolling Along. So, yes, that was another sort of entree into the African-American repertoire and raison d'etre.
Margret, I'm imagining because you started your career at such a young age that most of the friends you've kept or still are in contact with are musicians, other singers. Would that be right? And do you really keep in touch with them?
I think so. I mean, obviously a lot of them dropped off, and some of in the early folk scare days where I emerged, it was possible to do it more or less as a hobby, and not that many of the early practitioners ended up being able to sustain a career doing that. And there's only really a handful of us still that you would remember and nominate, the Mike McClellans and Jeannie Lewis and myself, Doug Ashdown possibly, although I'm not sure he still performs. But those names, we're still around. But let me see. Yes, I love to keep in touch with the people, important people like that, Bill Lobel, Bill Lineker, as she was, from those days. But, as the years go by.
Yeah, indeed. Don't we know?
Yes.
Mark, do you remember the moment, was it at the Paul Robeson concert, for instance, do you remember the moment when you thought, I would really like to make this my career?
Oh, it was never quite like that. It was, I remember how it started though. Yes, my first job, somebody there noticed that I loved things like Mahalia Jackson's songs or Harry Belafonte's calypsos, and she knew of a concert series, Sunday afternoons at the Emerald Hill Theatre in South Melbourne, like a folk concert, a whole heap of people would get up and do stuff. And she said, you should go along to this concert. And so I did. She said, I know the bass player who plays in a little jazz trio that opens these concerts. And this jazz trio included Jerry Humphreys from the Loved Ones on clarinet. Anyway, I was introduced to Glenn Tomasetti and a whole heap of folk luminaries, as they turned out to be, Trevor Lucas and Martin Wyndham Reed, etc., and saw this parade of music which I had no idea about. This is 1962, I'd say. Chain gang songs and Chinese lullabies and bush music, and it was all on parade there. And I thought, oh, this is amazing. There's a whole other world happening because it wasn't being played on radio or anything like that. And so I met the